Welcome to the first meeting this year of the Middle East Forum. Several of you have asked me last fall, did we have a budget problem or what was happening that we didn't have many Middle East Forum meetings? And my response was that I thought it was important to do things that are meaningful and that are genuinely interesting as events take place and as we have guests who really have something to say, and not to have meetings for the sake of meetings. So we have 2 meetings scheduled this month. There will be a third you will get a fax for in a couple of days, and tomorrow or on Tuesday. And we hope that we will be able to keep up the schedule at about that pace throughout this winter and spring as events develop, including doing some things on Syria. We have a special guest today, a good friend to many of us. Avi is known to many of you, and certainly his writings are. I understand Milton Bjorst had a review of Avi's most recent book, which is entitled, Avi?
The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World.
And that review was in Tuesday's Washington Post. Avi today is going to talk about Israel, the revised edition, a little bit about the history of Israel and the new historian's view of the history of Israel. And that will obviously touch on some issues that are in the headlines today. And during our question and discussion period, he will obviously respond to any of your remarks. We are very, very pleased to have you with us, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Judith, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought it was also a great honor to be invited to speak at the Council on Foreign Relations, but the immigration officer at the airport was more skeptical. He took some persuasion that this is a respectable institute. The title of my talk is Israel, the Revised Edition, and the title is borrowed from a recent article by Ethan Bronner in the New York Times Book Review, in which in the New York Times Book Review, yes, in which he reviewed 2 recent books, 2 new books, one by Benny Morris and the other by myself. It's a good title because it cuts to the very heart of the debate about Israel's history. The controversy is about the revised edition of Israel's history, which has emerged over the last decade from the work of the so-called new historians or revisionist Israeli historians. On the one hand, you have the new historians who have challenged the traditional Zionist version of the Arab-Israeli conflict. On the other hand, you have the defenders of the Orthodox version, the keepers of the labor Zionist flame, such as Shabtai Teveth, Ephraim Karsh, and most recently, Professor Anita Shapira. And it is no exaggeration to call this debate the war of the Israeli historians, or at least the Historikerstreit, the quarrel of the Israeli historians. The war or the quarrel broke out in 1988 with the publication of 4 books. Simcha Flapan, The Birth of Israel, Myths and Realities. Benny Morris, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem. Ilan Pappé, Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, and my own book, Collusion Across the Jordan, King Abdallah, the Zionist Movement, and the Partition of Palestine. Shabtai Tevet led the counterattack with a series of articles in the Israeli daily Haaretz and an article in commentary called Charging Israel with Original Sin. There are 5 main bones of contention in the debate between the old and the new historians. 1, Britain's policy during the twilight of the British Mandate. The old historians say that Britain's aim was to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state. We say Britain's main aim was to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. 2, the military balance in 1948. They maintain that the Arabs had overwhelming superiority, and they depict the contest as a war between a Jewish David and an Arab Goliath. They frequently use the mantra Me'atim mul Rabim, the few against the many. We maintain that the Jewish forces outnumbered all the Arab forces, regular and irregular, operating in the Palestine theater, and after the first round of hostilities, they outgunned them too. In this war, as in most other wars, the stronger side won, so there was no miracle here. 3, the causes of the Palestinian exodus. The old historians say that the Palestinians left of their own accord or on orders from above, and in the expectation of a triumphal return. We say that there were many causes to the Palestinian exodus, but a large number of the Palestinian refugees were pushed out. So although there were a number of causes to the Palestinian exodus, the single most important cause was Israeli political, psychological, and military pressure. 4, Arab war aims. The old historians portray the Arab coalition as united behind a single aim, a single objective of destroying the infant Jewish state and throwing the Jews into the sea. We suggest that the members of this coalition were deeply divided among themselves, and indeed it was the inability of the Arabs to coordinate the diplomatic and military strategy which was an important factor, a significant factor in the disaster that overwhelmed them. In other words, Arab unity is fiction, not fact. The 5th and final bone of contention is about the reasons for the political deadlock after the guns fell silent. The old historian's explanation of the failure to achieve peace can be summed up in 2 words: Arab intransigence. Israel's leaders, they argue, strove indefatigably for peace, but there was no one to talk to on the Arab side. We show, on the basis of declassified Israeli documents, that the Arab rulers, King Farouk of Egypt, King Abdallah of Transjordan, Hosni Zaim of Syria, were all pragmatic and all prepared to negotiate. Each Arab ruler had his price for peace. We can debate whether it was worth Israel's while paying the price they demanded for peace. But we can lay to rest once and for all the claim that there was no one to talk to on the Arab side. Indeed, with David Ben-Gurion in power, a strong case can be made for arguing that there was no one to talk to on the Israeli side. To sum up, the old historians claim that we charge Israel with original sin. I believe that it is the old historians who, in the face of compelling evidence to the contrary, still cling to the doctrine of Israel's Immaculate Conception. 10 years on, there is no let-up in the war of the historians. This war is not conducted exclusively in the precincts of academia. The Israeli public is intensely interested in this debate. The media in Israel gives it extensive coverage. The newspapers give almost a blow-by-blow account of pitched battles fought between scholars at conferences organized in university campuses. It's not just a handful of scholars, but the whole nation which is confronting its past. For the debate about 1948 cuts to the very core of Israel's image of herself. Are there winners and losers in this war of the Israeli historians? It's not for me to say because I'm one of the protagonists. But my impression, and this impression is widely shared, my impression is that over the last decade, the old historians have been steadily losing ground and the new historians have been steadily gaining ground. What was regarded as dangerous revisionism in many quarters 10 years ago is now almost mainstream thinking. Possibly there is a similar trend going on here in America. I don't know for sure because I don't live here, but some of my best friends are Americans, and that's what they tell me. In Israel, the public, it seems to me, is more willing than some of the old historians to reopen the past and to confront their history, warts and all. At least half the Israeli public takes that attitude. The other half, that is the half of Israel which is westernized, which is liberal, which is enlightened, and open to persuasion. But the other half is the religious half of Israeli society with different party political affiliations. They are not very open or very receptive to the findings of the new history. They have their own convictions, their belief of divine promise of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria to the Israeli people, to the Jewish people, and are really not very interested in the kind of things that we are writing. So far, the debate has focused very largely on 1948. In 1993, Benny Morris published Israel's Border Wars, 1949 to 1956. This focuses on Arab infiltration, Israeli retaliation, and the countdown to Suez. In the last few months, 2 new books have appeared. One book is by Benny Morris, Righteous Victims, A History of the Zionist Arab Conflict, 1881 to 1999. The book is published by Alfred Knopf. The other book is my own book, The Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World, which is published by W. Norton. Both books are wide in scope. I cover Israel's policy towards the Arabs in the first 50 years of statehood. Benny Morris traces the history of the conflict from its origins in the late 19th century to the present. I cannot speak for Benny Morris, but I would like to say a few words about my book. First, the title. The title of my book, like the title of this talk, is borrowed. In 1923, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of the Israeli right, published an article entitled On the Iron Wall. He argued that it was naive to expect Arab nationalists to welcome a Jewish state in the midst of Palestine. Negotiations with the Arabs in the early stages would be futile. The only way to realize the Zionist project was behind an iron wall of Jewish military strength. In other words, the Zionist project could only be achieved unilaterally and by military force. So the crux of Jabotinsky's strategy was to deal with the Arabs from a position of unassailable strength. But his article also incorporated a sophisticated theory of change in Arab attitudes towards the Jewish state. Jabotinsky envisaged two stages. The first stage was to build the Iron Wall. The Arabs were expected to bash their heads repeatedly against this Iron Wall until they gave up any hope of destroying the Jewish state. The shift towards moderation or realism on the Arab side was to be followed by stage two, by negotiations. Negotiations with the Palestinian Arabs about their status and their national rights in Palestine. Jabotinsky's critics retorted that his militarism was immoral. This kind of humbug was typical of the old labor movement, and it is still typical of some of the old historians today. But if you're interested in morality and justice, you shouldn't go into politics. You should become a rabbi. Politics is the second oldest profession, only with looser morals. Jabotinsky poured scorn on his critics on the left, on the vegetarians. He called them hypocrites, and he said that it was a mitzvah, a sacred duty, to expose their hypocrisy. He rounded on his critics in a second article entitled "The Morality of the Iron Wall." From the point of view of morality, he argued, there are two possibilities. Either Zionism was bad or it was good. If it was bad, it should be abandoned. If it was good, if it was a positive force, if it had justice on its side, then it had to triumph regardless of the wishes of anyone else. Jabotinsky's analysis was surely correct. This was a conflict between two national movements that could not be resolved by negotiation or compromise as long as the Arabs had any hope of winning the battle against the Jewish state. A voluntary agreement between the two sides was unattainable. I argue in the book that Jabotinsky's strategy was adopted in all but name by his Labour Party opponents, led by David Ben-Gurion. The strategy of the Iron Wall became the cornerstone of Israel's strategy in the conflict with the Arab world. And most importantly, I argue that the strategy worked. The history of the State of Israel is a vindication of the Iron Wall. The Arabs, first the Egyptians, then the Palestinians, then the Jordanians, recognized sooner or later Israel's invincibility, and they were compelled to negotiate with her from a position of palpable weakness. Syria is negotiating with Israel today. The real danger for Israel is to fall in love with the Iron Wall and to refuse to move to stage two of the strategy, negotiations and compromise, which means the partition of Palestine with the Palestinians. Paradoxically, the politicians of the right, the heirs to Ze'ev Jabotinsky, are more prone to adopt stage one of the Iron Wall strategy as a permanent way of life than the politicians of the left. Yitzhak Shamir conceived of the Iron Wall as a bulwark against change, as an instrument for keeping the Palestinians in a permanent state of subjugation and of subservience to Israel. Yitzhak Shamir was not interested in negotiations. He was not interested in trading land for peace. He was fully committed to the ideology of the land of Israel. Avishai Margalit wrote in the New York Times book review that Shamir was a two-dimensional man. One dimension was the breadth of the land of Israel. The other dimension was the length of the land of Israel. And since his historic vision was measured in inches, it was predictable that he will refuse to yield an inch. It was the Labour Party's Yitzhak Rabin who took the plunge, who made the transition to stage 2 by negotiating the Oslo Accord with the PLO in 1993. The accord that was clinched here in Washington, in the White House, with the historic handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. With the election of Benjamin Netanyahu in 1996, Israel was back to phase 1 of the Iron Wall. Netanyahu did not accept the Oslo Accords. He spent 3 years in power trying to undermine, subvert, and delay the Oslo process, only to discover that the Oslo process had become irreversible. The last Israeli election in May was consequently a major landmark in the history of Israel's relations with the Arabs. The Israeli public passed a severe judgment on Netanyahu and gave Ehud Barak a clear mandate to proceed with the Oslo Accords towards completion, and to also complete the circle of peace by negotiating with Syria. This is why I ended the epilogue to my book on an optimistic note, describing Barak's election as the sunrise after the 3 dark and terrible years during which Israel had been led by the unreconstructed proponents of the Iron Wall. Barak has already repaired some of the damage done by his predecessor. But as we enter the 21st century, Barak, his nation, and the Arabs still have to continue to grapple with the pervasive legacy of the Iron Wall. Finally, I would like to explore the question of why it is that the new historiography provokes such angry and aggressive responses in some Israeli quarters. The reviews of our work by Shabtai Tevet, by Ephraim Karsh, and by Anita Shapira are full of venom, vituperation, ad hominem attacks, and even personal abuse. Why? If you ask them, they'll probably tell you that the reason why is that the new historiography is driven by a political agenda, that our real aim is to call into question the moral foundations of Zionism and the legitimacy of the State of Israel. This is a very serious charge, but our opponents produce no evidence to support this charge. They are unable to produce evidence to support this charge for the simple reason that it is not true and there is no evidence available to substantiate it. My own guess as to why our critics get so hot under the collar about our work is that perhaps they realize that they are losing the battle for the hearts and minds of our compatriots. Bernard Wasserstein said to me at Oxford, after reading Anita Shapira's vitriolic article in the New Republic, in a typically feline Oxford fashion, it has to be said, her article is redolent of defeat on the intellectual battlefield. While I emphatically deny that the new historiography is propelled by political motives, it is undeniable that it has far-reaching political consequences. I've already mentioned its impact on public opinion in Israel. Even more significant is its impact on the way that history is taught in Israeli schools. History textbooks for high schools have been rewritten to incorporate some of the findings of the new history. Ethan Bronner wrote about this in the New York Times last August. He spoke of a quiet revolution in the teaching of history to most Israeli pupils. My friends in Israel tell me that I now represent the new orthodoxy. In other words, they say that I used to be a young Turk, but now I have become an old jerk. Not true. It's not as if the standard Zionist version of the conflict has been jettisoned and replaced by an alternative version, by the revisionist version of Israel's history. Rather, the new textbooks expose Israeli pupils to more complex accounts of Israel's history. They expose them to different interpretations, conflicting interpretations, and this creates space for discussion and debate. And this is a wholly positive development. And it is a tribute to the sophistication and the maturity of the Israeli public. At least half the Israeli public, the half that I was talking about earlier. It is also a reflection on the courage and liberalism of some of the ministers in the present Israeli government, in particular Yossi Sarid, the Minister of Education, who has presided over these educational reforms, and Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister. Yossi Sarid issued an apology to the Arabs of Kfar Qasem, the village inside Israel, whose inhabitants were massacred on the eve of the Sinai War. Ehud Barak, for his part, apologized. I'm sorry, he did not apologize. From the podium of the Knesset, he expressed regret for the suffering of the Palestinians. He did not apologize, nor did he assume any Israeli responsibility for the suffering of the Palestinians. But he expressed regret, and that was a very important step to take. Sometimes words speak louder than deeds. This brings me to one other significant political effect of the new historiography, namely, it helps to create a climate on both sides of the Arab-Israeli divide, which is conducive to the peace process, which helps the peace process to go forward. It enables the Israelis to see how the Arabs perceive Israel and how the Arabs view the past. And it presents to the Arabs an account of the conflict which they recognize as honest as genuine, as being in line with their own experience, instead of the stale old official rhetoric, instead of the usual propaganda of the victors. Without this kind of historical awareness and empathy, genuine reconciliation is not possible, and comprehensive peace, if it is achieved, will remain a shallow peace, a formal peace, a cold peace, a peace between governments rather than between peoples. To conclude, the new history is about history, not about current politics. But if my colleagues and I have made a contribution, however modest, towards breaking down the psychological barrier that still separates Israel from her Arab neighbors, then our labor has already been amply rewarded. Thank you.
The War of the Historians will continue here at the Council. I've already had, when we sent out the invitation, we already had one suggestion from one of our members to invite one of the people who is on the other side of this argument that Avi mentioned, and we are in the process of trying to get that person to be with us when he's in the States later in the spring. I neglected to just give you a couple of headlines from Avi's very, very impressive resume. He was born in Baghdad, of all places. He's a professor of international relations and a fellow of St. Antony's College in Oxford. He was, for many years, the Alastair Buchan Reader in International Relations. Today, he is the Director of Graduate Studies in International Relations. And his various degrees and studies and his list of publications and books is well known to many of you. It's too long to go into here. But this is obviously a man with very thoughtful man with very good credentials. We will begin our discussion. Please use a mic and identify yourself. Who would like to begin? Yes.
Thank you, Jim, for the interaction. Thank you for a wonderful talk. You laid to rest the charge that the political motivation for your theses. You laid to rest that charge that it was politically motivated, that Israel, that you undermined, that would be undermining the moral foundations of the political state of Israel. You may have undermined the charge, but does your work in any way actually undermine the generally received moral foundations of the political state of Israel?
I'm a historian. My job is to tell the story of the Arab-Israeli conflict as fully as I can, as accurately as I can, and as interestingly as I can. The political consequences, the political fallout from my work, the political uses that various groups might choose to make of my work is of very little interest to me. I have no control over that. But to answer your question more directly, I would dispute, I don't believe that my work and the work of my colleagues undermines the legitimacy of Israel, because the legitimacy of Israel doesn't depend on what happened in 1948, doesn't depend on this atrocity or that. It's beyond question. On ne demande pas à une nation pourquoi elle existe. You don't ask a nation why it exists, and you shouldn't ask that question of Israel. It exists, and it's a legitimate state, as legitimate as any other. So I really don't believe that our work has such a damaging effect on Israel and on its reputation abroad. I know that some people in Israel do think that. There is a novelist called Aharon Meged who hasn't read, I don't know whether he reads English, he certainly hasn't read any of our books, but he wrote an article in Haaretz saying that we are leading Israel towards collective suicide. Well, Israel is the strongest military power in the Middle East. It has nuclear weapons. Its security is beyond challenge. And this kind of talk really gives paranoia a bad name.
One of the few heroes of your book is...
Please identify
I'm sorry, John Alterman, U.S. Institute of Peace. One of the few heroes in your book is Moshe Sharet, vegetarian in Jabotinsky's terms, who was working in the 1950s for negotiating with the Arabs and was displaced by David Ben-Gurion. And I've never really seen an account of what happened to vegetarian thought as it passed out of favor in the 1950s. Where did it go? Where had it been bubbling along? And did it really cease to exist after people like Buber and Sharet were saying things that would be very, even left of where the left in Israel is now?
The internal struggle between hardliners and moderates is the central theme of my book. And the most dramatic confrontation occurred in the early 50s between Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet. And for a short period between 1953 and 1955, Sharet was also Prime Minister. And he represented a completely different school of thought. He saw the Arabs not just as enemies, but as a people, a sensitive and proud people, as he once put it. He was much more sensitive than Ben-Gurion to the psychological side of the conflict. And he did not want to escalate the conflict. He was very skeptical about the use of military reprisals to keep hammering away at the Arabs until they accepted Israel. He wanted a different climate, a climate that would be conducive to dialogue and negotiations. And he was quite successful in establishing a back channel to Gamal Abdel Nasser. And this is one of the most interesting revelations, if not a secret, that is in the book. I gathered all the documents I possibly could about this dialogue between Nasser and Sharet, which was quite promising because Nasser recognized that Sharet was an honest man and a moderate man and wanted to cooperate with him. But the Israeli defense establishment had no time for this kind of appeasement and systematically subverted and undermined Sharet's foreign policy and his position at home. First, there was the Lavon affair, which was quite a blow to the dialogue, but it didn't kill it. Then when Ben-Gurion came as defense minister in February 1955, the first thing he did was to launch the devastating Gaza raid, and that killed the dialogue stone dead. Israelis of the Ben-Gurion school say that Sharet was a non-entity, that he was a really weak man, he was a pedant, he didn't represent an alternative school of thought to the one that Ben-Gurion expounded. But I would dispute this claim, and I would point out to you that Ben-Gurion drove Sharet out of power early in 1956. He drove him out of power because he wanted to launch a preventive war, in inverted commas. If there was no differences between them, if Sharet did not represent an alternative, why get rid of him? But the fact is that Sharet was an intellectual, he had a deep understanding of the conflict, he had an alternative foreign policy, it was a promising policy, he put it to the test and it was working, but it was undermined not by the Arabs, but by his own people, by his own defense establishment. And Sharet's fall from power represents the collapse of the moderate school in Israeli politics, though not in Israeli opposition and not among Israeli intellectuals, but it represented the collapse of the moderate school in Israeli politics.
Richard.
Dick Parker, Middle East Institute. There's been some revisionism on the archaeological side as far as Israel is concerned. I wonder if this has any impact on the dialogue about on the War of the Historians. The findings of I think it's Dr. Herzog that Kamal Salibi has been arguing that the children of Israel turned right instead of left when they came out of Sinai, and Herzog is saying they weren't even in Sinai to begin with. But has this had any kind of impact on the historians' debate?
Israelis are terribly interested in archaeology. It's a nation of amateur archaeologists. And the reason why there is such a popular interest in archaeology is the wish to find evidence that this is where they belong and that they have returned to the ancestral home. So there are different schools of Israeli sociologists as well, and they also, their work, which is professional work, also has political implications. Their work is used in the debate on whether Israel always had its roots in Palestine. But the work of the archaeologists hasn't really impacted on the debate between the historians.
Rocky, please take mic.
Avi, I wonder if you could relate what you've just been talking about Shorat and Nasser to, I think it was called Project Alpha, where Kim Roosevelt had a back channel to the Israelis and to the Egyptians at about the same time. I guess the question is, how did the two relate, and to what extent in your book were you able? I know some of this has been declassified in U.S. archives. What did you find? Why did it stop? What were the causes of its drying up and so forth? How did it proceed?
Project Alpha was the plan for Israeli-Egyptian peace based on border modifications, and this was unacceptable to Israel and therefore never got anywhere. But the more interesting American attempt to mediate between Israel and Egypt was the Anderson mission. Robert Anderson was President Eisenhower's personal envoy, and he sent him on a secret shuttle between Jerusalem and Cairo. Anderson met several times Ben-Gurion and Nasser, and he couldn't get anywhere despite his efforts, because Ben-Gurion insisted on meeting Nasser face to face and negotiating directly without an American mediator. He knew that Nasser couldn't possibly agree to meet him face to face, and the mission was aborted.
Milton Viorst. Avi, you didn't quite answer John's question a minute ago. The fact is that Moshe Sharet was really standing out there all by himself. At least that's the feeling we get from your book, and that's the feeling that I have always had. Wherein was the support for a more moderate course? I mean, was Sharet as lonely a figure as your book seems to confirm, and that Israeli history seems to suggest? There really was no strong moderate force. And yet this is within the context of Ben-Gurion publicly, in any event, constantly denouncing Jabotinsky and the revisionists and the militarism and blah, blah, blah. I mean, but Ben-Gurion had made himself as the leader on the grounds of establishing some sort of diplomatic structure for Israel's birth and life after that. And yet, when it came to some sort of critical mass to support that, it really wasn't there. How is that to be explained?
Moshe Shoret did not stand alone. The entire foreign ministry was behind him. Many of the diplomats were from Anglo-Saxon countries, and they were called the Anglo-Saxon clique, but not just Anglo-Saxons. An important aide to Shoret was Gidon Raphael, who was his advisor, who was a real moderate. Abba Iban, who was ambassador to Washington and to the UN. So the entire foreign ministry was moderate and supported the Shoret line. But in Israel, the defense establishment is much stronger, always has been and still is, than the diplomatic establishment. And Ben-Gurion, as a person, quite apart from his power base, was a much tougher character than Shoret. There was never any doubt that in any showdown between the two, Ben-Gurion would emerge on top. But it's not true to say that there was no support for Shoret in the government or in the Labour Party. Shoret had his following in the Labour Party, but he never pressed his differences with Ben-Gurion to a real showdown, either in the party or in the government. He used to complain, he used to try and restrain Ben-Gurion. He mobilized majorities in the cabinet against some of the more outlandish proposals that Ben-Gurion tabled to the cabinet. But by and large, he was a secondary figure, whereas David Ben-Gurion was the dominant figure. He set the tone, and Shoret was not strong enough, nor did he have a strong enough domestic political base to challenge Ben-Gurion's leadership.
Philip Matar, Institute for Palestine Studies. Avi, why did it take 4 decades for some of these issues to be debated and for them to be accepted when there was considerable evidence that Palestinians were expelled and that the military balance was lopsided, at least at the end of the war? Obviously, the archives, the PRO and the Israel State Archives, helped to reveal some of these, but there was a considerable amount of discussion in the 60s and 70s in particular by scholars pointing out to a great deal of evidence about the expulsion. And so why did it take 40 years for this to become known in Israel and in the West? Why did so many historians, dozens of historians of the Arab-Israel conflict, to miss the enormous amount of evidence that was known?
For those who don't know the speaker, Philip Matar is a Palestinian revisionist historian, and he wrote a biography of the Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini. I cannot but agree with you that it took quite a long time for some of the evidence to come into the public domain. The 30-year rule, Israel's 30-year rule, is a very important factor because the old history was not based on documents, whereas the new history was written for the most part by professional historians who had their training in Britain, and it is based on archival research. But you're quite right in suggesting that many of the ideas of the new history are not new. People on the Israeli left had long ago believed that Israel was diplomatically intransigent. There was a book in the 1960s by 2 Israeli communists called Peace, Peace, and There Is No Peace, which has just been reprinted in Israel. the debate about the Palestinian refugees has been going on since 1948. And some Israelis have argued what Benny Morris has argued much more convincingly on the basis of evidence, that many Palestinians were expelled. But your colleague Walid Khalidi had been writing about these issues, about 1948, about the war, about Plan Dalet, and about the expulsion of the Palestinians. So someone like him must have been rather surprised to see that when an Israeli scholar says, yes, we expelled Palestinians, everyone looks up in astonishment, and no one took seriously all this work by Palestinian historians. One can't change the past, but at least now we have a very good understanding of the issues and a great deal of new material. So it doesn't matter that it took Israel so long to get to this point. We've got to this point.
I'm troubled by the title.
Identify yourself, please.
Robert Bowie. I'm troubled with the title of your book because Iron Wall makes Israeli policy seem static. It seems to me from the very beginning, Israeli policy was highly dynamic, the intention of expanding. Just two things. One, when it was, I think Charette or somebody else, anyway, was here in Washington to tell Truman that the war had been ended and that Israel was now going to declare itself to be a state. He wanted to say that they had vindicated the UN partition. And Ben-Gurion said, no, I don't want to refer to the partition. That establishes the boundaries. Second, when Anderson came back, his conclusion was that Ben-Gurion was not interested in any negotiation which would in effect settle boundaries, and that it was hopeless to get any kind of negotiation started. So it seems to me that really from the beginning, the Labor Party has been expanding in the name of security, and the other side has been expanding in the name of the Lord. But both sides have been engaged in this heavy practice of expansion from the beginning.
It's no part of my argument that Israel has been a status quo power since 1948. On the contrary, one of my differences with my more traditional colleagues is that I believe that there's been a strong streak of territorial expansionism in Israel's foreign policy from the beginning. And Ben-Gurion was a leading territorial expansionist. He was never reconciled to the permanent loss of the West Bank. But the best evidence of his expansionism, territorial expansionism, is from his own diary for October 1956, the month of the collusion preceding the tripartite attack between Britain, France, and Israel against Egypt. He had this idea for a new political order in the Middle East, in which Israel would expand to the Suez Canal and annex the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel would divide Jordan, which he said was an artificial entity, with Iraq. Iraq would take the East Bank, Israel would take the West Bank, and the Palestinian refugees would be settled on the East Bank. And Israel would expand up to the Litani River in Lebanon and turn Lebanon into a nice, coherent, cohesive Christian state which would sign a peace agreement with Israel. Ben-Gurion's followers say, well, this was a long shot. He wasn't serious about it. But I counted in his diary for October 1956 six times he elaborated this plan, and he would tell it to anyone who was willing to listen. So I believe he was an expansionist. In my book, in the first draft of the book, I called him a born land grabber. But one of my research students read it and asked me to tone down my language. So I didn't use the term a born land grabber, but that's what he was. Menachem Begin, after the Lebanon War, gave a speech at the Israeli Staff College on the theme of wars of choice and wars of no choice. And he admitted that the war in Lebanon was a war of choice, that Israel's security was not under threat, that he went to war to achieve political and territorial political objectives, far-reaching political objectives. But he argued that the Sinai War was also a war of choice, that war was undertaken for political and territorial objectives. And on this, I agree with Menachem Begin.
Marvin?
Marvin Kalb with the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. You described a war of historians, and having heard you now, I can well understand why there's been a war, because there have been a lot of things that you said tonight that certainly strike me as highly controversial. And I'm not a historian, so I don't know this period very well, and I don't want to deal with all of the things that I find controversial, but let's deal with just one. I think you mentioned early on that there were 3 Arab leaders in 1948 who were prepared to strike a peace agreement with the new Israeli state. I don't remember the 3 you mentioned, but perhaps you could give us some more information on that. I would imagine if there were 3 Arab leaders at that time interested in peace, that the journalists who were covering the war at that time, European, American, Arab journalists, would have been writing about that. And I don't remember stories to that effect, so perhaps you could help me.
Okay. The new history is controversial, but it is well documented. That is the important thing to bear in mind. As for the 3 leaders that I mentioned, in 1949 there were King Farouk of Egypt. He sent some peace feelers to Israel because he wanted to disengage from the Palestine war, and he had his price. He wanted certain parts of Sinai in return for a tacit peace with Israel, not a formal peace. More important and much more upfront was King Abdullah of Jordan, who had had a special relationship with the Jewish Agency going back a long way. And he was very serious about peace, even during in fact, he had a deal with Golda Meir in November 1947 to partition Palestine at the expense of the Palestinians. And then things went wrong, and the Arab Legion went to war, and there were clashes between the Israeli army and King Abdullah's army. But they were still the best of enemies, Israel and Jordan, during the war. And immediately after the end of the war, Abdullah renewed the dialogue with Israel, and I believe that there was a real prospect of an overall settlement with Jordan, but Ben-Gurion was rather unyielding. And the result was that the negotiations continued, but in 1951, Abdullah was assassinated. But the most interesting example is Hosni Zaim, the leader of Syria, in 1949. He didn't say secretly that he wants peace with Israel. He told a journalist, a Western journalist, that his ambition, his aim, is to be the first Arab leader to make peace with Israel. The Israelis sometimes say that Arabs only in private and in great secrecy say that they want peaceful relations, but they would never admit this publicly. Zaim said this publicly. He offered Israel full peace, an exchange of ambassadors, open borders, normal economic relations, and the settlement of 250,000 Palestinian refugees, a third of the total, a settlement of 250,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria in return for peace. He had his price. He wanted the border to run down between Israel and Syria to be down the middle of Lake Galilee. But he was willing to negotiate, and Ben-Gurion refused to negotiate. Zaim wanted to meet Ben-Gurion in order to break the logjam lower down among the officials. Ben-Gurion refused to meet him. Zaim repeated the request to meet face-to-face with Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion wouldn't give him the light of day. Was there an opportunity for peace then? I don't know. History doesn't tell us what might have happened. All I know is that there was an Arab leader who was willing to talk, who was willing to negotiate, who was willing to bargain, and yet there was no one to talk to on the Arab side. So if this opportunity was missed, it's not because of Arab intransigence, it was because of Israeli intransigence.
I would remind you also, all of you, Marvin, that the Sadat's gesture before the 73 war, his secret envoy, that was not reported by journalists, and you were shuttling in those days, or not yet. And no, that was after, sorry. And also the PLO Oslo Israeli talks, we didn't know about it till it was done, and I'm sure that as history reveals itself, we're going to find a lot of other secret contacts. So there have been lots of missed opportunities on all sides. I want to end, Avi, with a current question. You talked about constituency, that Sharet didn't have the constituency. I wonder if you can tell us, what do you think today is Barak's actual constituency? This is a man who has only recently left the military. He is at the beginning of his political career rather than at the end, as Rabin was when he got the light about making peace. Barak is trying to manage a very difficult, what I call a five-tribe coalition of Ashkenazi secular, Ashkenazi Orthodox, Sephardic religious Shas, and Russian Jews and Israeli Arabs. So far, there have been some threats by Sharansky to pull out on the Golan, by Shas to pull out if they don't get money, and so on. So as he moves in the direction of establishing a new history and a different future for Israel, how do you see his own constituency developing and supporting him? Does he really have the ground to stand on to do what he seems determined to do?
Barak won a decisive victory in the last election and a clear mandate. And Barak is neither a dove nor a hawk. He is a hybrid. He stands bang in the middle of the Israeli political spectrum. He fought at the last election for the middle ground, and he captured it, and he's determined to retain the middle ground in Israeli politics, because he knows from the experience of his mentor, Yitzhak Rabin, that you cannot make peace with the Arabs with only half the nation on your side. You need more than half the nation. You need a majority. Barak is very much like Rabin. He's a soldier who turned to peacemaking. Barak, I believe, knows what the bottom line is of the Syrians, and that he knows he would have to pay the price of complete withdrawal from the Golan Heights. I believe that despite the dissent and the protest in Israel for concessions to Syria, he would be able to mobilize a majority for a deal if he can present to the Israeli public an attractive package, if he can demonstrate that Israel's security would be enhanced rather than impaired by a peace deal with Syria. At the last election, Barak went to the Golan Heights and told the settlers that if he is elected, he would want peace with Syria, and this would involve painful decisions, indicating that they would have to move, to withdraw. So he would get a majority of the Israeli public, he would get a majority in the Knesset, and even a majority among the settlers on the Golan. Barak is a general, and in Israel, only the generals have credibility in negotiating peace with the Arabs. Barak is the right man at the right place at the right time. And if he had a heart, his heart would be in the right place.
Well, I would remind you all on the Syrian-Israeli track that Hafez al-Assad, since the days when Marvin and Bernie were shuttling with Henry Kissinger, that Hafez al-Assad's position has not changed. Why he's doing it now, why it's going to work now, may be answered by what Avi has just said. Avi, we thank you. We hope that you and one of your opponents will actually be in the United States at the same time, sometime in the future, so we can have the war right here at the council. But for right now, we'll listen to one side at a time. Thank you very, very much, and thank you all.